Good morning, good afternoon. Welcome to USI's June webinar series featuring Todd Kozikowski. He's the CEO and founder of Forewarn. I'm Beth Johnson. I'll be moderating today with the help of Jim Kane also. Before I introduce Todd, just a couple of logistics. We are recording the session, so you'll receive an email with the link to it in the next couple of days. There were a couple of pre-submitted questions that we'll get to. Feel free to send additional questions into the chat. Please do the chat option to all panelists. It makes it a little easier for us to keep track of those. Your lines are muted. You won't have a chance to unmute, so chat will be the way to get to us. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Todd. At Forewarn, he leads the efforts to expose emerging risks that are fueled by search manipulations, AI exploitation, and coordinated digital abuse. As a veteran technology leader, Todd has guided companies from startup through IPO, helping generate more than $5 billion in market value. He's known for developing advanced intelligence strategies that predict litigation risk and cyber threats. He holds his BS from Bates College and pursued advanced studies in astrophysics at Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. So that seems like it'll probably be a different webinar to talk about all things astrophysics related. But Todd, thank you again for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you for everyone at USI for the opportunity to share what we do at Forewarn. And certainly thank you all for taking the hour here to connect and to spend some time with this topic. This is going to be, I think, hopefully a really eye-opening session for many of you who are looking at kind of next generation risk, trying to understand how AI is playing into that ecosystem. And we're going to share a lot of examples over the next 40 minutes. And really what I'd like to kind of highlight for everyone today, organizations are all facing a new form of risk and new fraud exposure. And what we're going to talk about today is search engine optimization and AI optimization, AIO. It's a new term. And we're not looking at just deep fakes, deep photos, images of car accidents or receipts. We're talking about the manipulation and the change of how the internet actually works, how search works on the internet, and how it can be manipulated by opportunists as well as fraudsters. We're going to take a look at brand exploitation, how synthetic websites can be created, and a whole host of other cyber threats that we see in the work that we do at Forewarn. We'll discuss how opportunists target companies, and we'll share some very specific examples today. And then we're going to talk about what do we do about it. It's one thing to identify it, but how do we turn that into action? How do we turn that into action across our company? Because this, as we'll find out, it's not just, say, a claims issue or an underwriting issue or a marketing issue. This really is a collective effort because the risk hits companies in different ways. So just a brief introduction for how this got started and why this got started. Forewarn was created about 2 years ago. And so we've not been in the market very long. It's only been just a little over 24 months, but our research started a little bit longer before that. And it really started in large thanks to a company called Demotech, which is a rating agency. They've been in business for over 40 years. And they were doing a post-mortem analysis of several companies that had failed in the Florida marketplace. Joe Petrelli, who is the president of Demotech, really was one of the very first in Florida to rate companies when none other would. And in late 2018, 2019, there was an unprecedented amount of new lawsuits that were being filed in Florida. And in that time, and we'll share some of this data, many of those companies had failed. And Joe went back to understand and really ask the question, why and how? How did this happen? And so Joe reached out to me. He and I had been involved in several projects in the past. Over the past 30 years, I had spent a number of years in building technology companies, as you've heard, but also doing some joint research projects and intelligence projects for several big search engines on the side. And so with that background, part of the analysis was to look at some of the digital targeting that was taking place and what happened in Florida. And that opened up kind of a slew of new forms of risk, and this is what we'll share today. The company, since then, we're founded by a group of engineers and data scientists and business leaders. We've worked with associations and organizations actively day in, day out, including the NAIC, the National Insurance Crime Bureau, Coalition Against Insurance Fraud. And we're also actively engaged in working with federal agencies, including the FBI, the NSA, as well as one other three-letter acronym in DC for nation state sponsored cyber activity. So we will share some of those results today in the activity. This wasn't created out of thin air. We spent really a significant portion of our time, and still do, meeting from top down across a large number of folks across the industry, from regional carriers to mid-market, all the way up to large national carriers, to transportation businesses and reinsurers. All are being infected with this new type of risk. And to give you a sense of what we've heard from your peers across the industry, we would hear, for example, if a claim is filed, it's too late. How do we go up the pipeline to understand how this instigation had even started? That relationship, that kind of sacred relationship between an insurance carrier and their policyholder, is becoming more and more intercepted by some of the opportunists that we see, and using the techniques and tactics that we'll expose. And so how we prevent that and how we mitigate some of that exposure is a big part of what we'll talk about today. AI, as we know, is changing a lot of the business, but using AI, we have a new form of fraud that we have to detect, and having those tools available to us is a challenge. And so how we adapt to that is a clear challenge for many folks. Litigation funding. Never did we think that law firms and lawyers would be pawns to an investment chessboard. So how is that now replacing and changing and adding a new form of risk? We've also heard folks say, geez, we need an early warning system, not just for claims, but across the company. How do we collectively understand this new type of risk? And the last part is, we all have different definitions of social inflation. And how do we interpret that kind of on the same page and act on the same page with what that means? And to that end, social inflation, when we think of social inflation, we often think about it maybe in three ways. One is the growth of third-party litigation platforms, and you see AI being used to optimize what judge, what jurisdiction, what's the right settlement amount based on past history. That's informing AI on how to optimize. And then we also see, of course, the growth of third-party litigation funding, and of course, higher and higher settlement amounts and nuclear awards. All of that has been contributing, and I think that's been the storyline, certainly, for the past 3 to 5 years. But there's one other component to that really, in our minds, has really exacerbated this even more so, and that's this notion of search manipulation. Because if you think about it, you can't have a lawsuit without a claimant name. And one of the best and most effective ways to get to that claimant name is to be able to find them online and to intercept them in their engagement online. And as a result, what we're seeing is an increase in claim frequency above historical levels, leading to higher loss adjustment expenses and combined ratio challenges. It's putting pressure on teams to respond to this new type of risk. They may not have the technology, the metrics, the kind of the lens into this. We're also finding that there's a reluctance. Without hardcore evidence, it's hard to pursue. And part of that is because the fraud has evolved, and opportunism has become much more scientific. We're talking of new synthetic websites, not just people's IDs, but we're also talking about how we're seeing technology being used to create third-party websites that look and feel like our own website. They're copied almost like a doppelganger site. And we're seeing new attack surfaces across different technologies. And as a result, carriers are struggling to keep up with this, because by the time we detect it, it's too late. We've already made a payment out on a claim. The tools that we're using to analyze this, maybe the data is just not exactly in line with how to be able to find it. And maybe we also need to prioritize new KPIs around fraud, especially around this new emerging growth. So, these have all been contributing. And where I'd like to start in this discussion is with a definition, and then we're going to peel back into some examples. And the definition I wanted to start with, just so that we're all on the same page, is SEO, search engine optimization. Many of you may be familiar with that term, but it's nothing more than how do we move traffic to our site? How do we get engagement to our website? And traditionally, we can do that one of two ways. We can rank for that content by creating organic content in the form of blogs, keywords, certainly web articles, right? And we put those keywords strategically placed so that search bots can index that. They hopefully page rank that up high. And of course, we get an elevated position in say Google, so that we drive clicks. The other way is that we can buy it. We can bid on paid keywords, and we can spend money to entice. And of course, if we've run a search before, you've seen the paid ads, the sponsored ads at the top of search, and then the organic results. What we're going to talk about today is what happens when bad actors intercept and integrate malicious content inside those areas, inside paid ads, inside an outranking and organic search results. And to give you a sense, and just I mentioned here 190 billion was spent on search advertising. Just for comparison, when we drive around the country today and look at billboards, especially legal advertising, it seems you can't go to a city without seeing another ad. That market, that outdoor billboard market, was about 7 billion. So what we're talking about online is 25 times larger than what we're seeing. So this is a different world. So when we go back to that story of Demotech, looking and asking about, hey, Todd, could you run a post-mortem analysis on those companies that went under? What we're looking at here on the left-hand side are 7 to 8 companies that had become financially insolvent, and you're looking at new lawsuits year over year. These are not cumulative. These are brand new lawsuits filed in that year. And you can just see it's just a kind of up and to the right correlation, right? These companies were highly stressed. And Joe Petrelli from Demotech, really had the hypothesis to think that, maybe this was something more than just billboards and advertising, that there was maybe a possibility that they were being litigated to death. And that's exactly what we ended up uncovering. And we'll explain how that came about. So let's take you back historically. In March of 2022, when I started this research, we were looking at a public adjuster bidding on 1,200 keywords, spending $650,000 to generate 3,700 clicks a month. So right then and there, we have to pause, because this is an individual. This isn't a company. This isn't an organization. This is just one person with a budget of $650,000. There are not many companies that even have that type of budget for digital marketing, but this begins to kind of, tip your head a little to think, is there a business model here? And sure enough, there is. And you're starting to see they were targeting very specific insurance companies: Omega Insurance, Wesco Insurance, mobile homeowners in Louisiana, even though this public adjuster is based in Florida. What we also begin to see is how they were targeting and soliciting policyholders. If you think about search in general, search is very geo-dependent. If I do a search from my home versus my office headquarters versus maybe where I go to work out or wherever, search will change relative to your geography. And what opportunists started to figure out was that they could manipulate and outrank on search results in very specific geographies where brand was being outranked. So, for example, one of the tactics that we had started to unveil was being able to outrank for the claims department phone number. Many of us, if we have a tree fall on our house, we may not have the claims department phone number stored in our phone, but we might turn to a search engine and run a search. What we might find is that an opportunist has outranked for the claims department phone number. They may either use the 1-800 number and insert themselves above, or they may insert their own phone number with their own marks and brands and logos. What we started to do was call these numbers, and they would say, "Hi, we're company XYZ claims department." We'll say, "Yes. Are you company XYZ?" And they'll say, "Well, we're the claims department." We'll say, "Yes, we understand you're the claims department, but are you company XYZ?" And then click. And we would get this over and over again. And then Hurricane Idalia came, and it wasn't a particularly large hurricane, but by this point, we had our first set of clients in Florida, and they reached out to us and they said, "Todd, we're getting our first notice of loss, and yet the hurricane is 250 miles off the coast. We don't even have enough wind to fly a kite. How is it possible that this is happening?" And we started to analyze, and we started to realize that there were law firms setting up websites, bidding on keywords, $75 to $100 a click. And they were promising, they were saying, "Hey, if you file first, you'll be first in line, you get paid first as well. And so we started to see that generation happening. In Maui, just 48 hours after if you remember the fires, just 48 hours, we had lawyers flying in from out of state, soliciting folks that was actually technically illegal. They weren't licensed to do so. And they were sending, again, websites bidding on keywords, and the first lawsuits were happening. We had a client there in Hawaii who was receiving their first lawsuits not even 48 hours after the events had started. So that was the stress that we were seeing. And then the granddaddy of all was McClenny Mosley. Many of us may be familiar with this case. For those not, this was a law firm in Texas that took in $40 million in private equity funding. 14 of it was spent on targeted SEO marketing and campaigns. And they were targeting folks in Louisiana. And unfortunately, hundreds of folks' names were ended or were submitted as part of insurance claims fraudulently. And we were at this time early stages of calibrating our models and learning about the kind of digital behaviors that were happening online. And so we had certainly shared some results to the commissioner of insurance. And, at that time, it was considered opportunism. And of course, the story unfolds very differently today. Just to give you a sense in the marketplace, $114 is the going rate right now for a Los Angeles fire attorney. And why? It's because there are more folks creating advertisements, they're creating websites, they're creating clickbait opportunities, case evaluations. And while this is happening, we always say at Forewarn is we're not really worried too much about what you see online. That happens. SEO has the right to be there. It's what you don't see that we have the real concern, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Just to put this into context, large national consumer brands like Ford, Starbucks, McDonald's, they spend on average about $300,000 each per month to promote a product, a service, a drink, or so on. What we've uncovered at Forewarn is that there are law firms spending almost $2 million a month to promote their digital advertising and targeting on services. It's $2 million. It's almost $24 million a year just on pay-per-click advertising. So the problem, as you can imagine, is if it's now more than one firm, but what if there are hundreds of firms? That opens up a whole new form of risk across the industry, not just for companies, but for their clients, even personally. And this is what we're seeing. To give you a sense of that one law firm, as I mentioned, there are two ways that you can attract traffic to your site. Organically, this law firm will generate over 200,000 clicks in 1 month with their content schemes. On the paid side, they will bid on 74,000 keywords and very targeted keywords and generate 15,000 clicks. And together, they will target more than 100 different businesses. To give you a sense, in the 12 o'clock position is Walmart, two down is FedEx, but the other 98 all represent insurance companies. And what we're looking at is what we call a topologistics threat map. It looks at the magnitude and scale of targeting by this particular opportunist. And we can learn from this about where this is happening, what geographies are being targeted, what insurance lines are being targeted, what weaknesses in policy provision have they figured out to target as well. So we look at the loss types that they're analyzing as well. To give you a different perspective, imagine if you had a collection of opportunists grouped together to target one company. That's exactly what we're seeing here. These are 137 different opportunists in the form of law firms, contractors, like a roofer, to a public adjuster, as well as third-party entities. And these even include cyber groups that we'll talk through. Collectively, they spend $60 million to target one national carrier. And what you see on the right-hand side, all those little circles, the size of the circle corresponds to the size of, if you will, the resourcefulness and overall targeting by that opportunist. And inside that are the circles, the smaller circles represent the carriers that are being targeted. And so it allows us to track and monitor the different size and scale of targeting that's being done. So even the small circles, while they are small relative to some of the biggest circles in that ring, they still represent targeting and still represent claims and lawsuits. And that's the thing that we're uncovering. So we talked a lot about SEO, but there's this new thing called AI. And that's what we're here to talk about next is how is that now being manipulated? And with that context of SEO, today, when we run a search, we're now getting results from, for example, Google Gemini, and we see those search results appearing, and we're trusting that content. And Google uses that content. They use user engagement and behavioral signals from dwell time and click-through rates, and they're looking at human behavior to see and judge what information should be included inside a large language model. But the question we're here for is, could that potentially be hacked? And I wouldn't be here otherwise if we didn't. So sure enough, what we're seeing is an entire new attack surface. And that attack surface is in the form of auto-generated fake websites that appear and may look like yours, but are providing services, maybe selling insurance. And we're going to show examples of that. We're seeing AI-generated content in the form of articles, FAQs, blogs. Why? Well, that content gets indexed by search bots. It gets ranked as though it's traditionally normal content, but it's not. And so it's being manipulated. And then we see the emergence of synthetic backlink farms. What is that? Well, if I link to your website and you link to me, that's considered in the industry good link juice. I didn't make that term up, but that's the term that's used. We have good link juice. We're building a network. But what happens if you have someone that links to you that has a whole collection of really bad backlinks, spam, phishing schemes, malware schemes, or others? And that's what we're going to talk about and what that looks like. And so you can imagine there's a potential gamification here around AI. And there's a lot of potential pitfalls here as well. As much as there's a promise of good, and we're all starting to experiment with tools like ChatGPT, which are terrific, the rules of how that's evolving and what goes into those engines is changing. And that's what we're going to share today. So let's take an example. Let's look at, this is a client of ours, Louisiana citizen. I can share this. Richard Newberry allowed me to share this. He's the CEO of Louisiana Citizens. They're the insurer of last resort in Louisiana. An article was written about them from NPR. And this was a storyline that was a good story about their service and work around a particular hurricane. The article was taken by a group of bad actors in Russia. The articles were replaced, the links within the articles were replaced with links being served off of servers in Russia with phishing and malware schemes. The entire article was then backlinked, if you will, attached, if you will, to the domain of Louisiana Citizens. In the process, the marketing team thought, geez, this is such a great article. They wanted to promote it like anybody would, except they promoted the wrong article. And in the process, they put it out on social media. People were exposed. And so this exposed folks to, again, phishing and malware and other forms and schemes. But then you got to back up and ask the question, why would they do this? Why would a cyber criminal group overseas want to target an insurer of last resort? Well, one of the ways that you can knock a known brand off its kind of search pedestal, you think of some of the large national carriers, ones that have dominating marketing budgets and dominating marketing presence. There's something called domain authority. Domain authority represents your kind of search viability, your credibility online. Government agencies have higher search authority, right? There's lots of content, but they're a known validated source. Certain news organizations. But one of the ways that you can knock a large brand off its search pedestal is to apply this notion of toxic backlinks. And when you apply a bunch of them, you can suppress the domain authority of that targeted company. You do that enough times, and then you can launch the third attack, which is then you can actually outmarket them and outrank them in particular markets. And that's exactly what happened to Louisiana Citizens. So when you do that, you can then launch yet the next attack. And this is an example when the attack hits the federal government. This is FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the National Flood Insurance Program. These are known programs. And what we had detected early on through this scheme was this site was carbon copied and hosted off of a server in Germany. People were filing flood claims, going and reporting to this site. And as you could imagine, information was being stolen and being harvested and then being resold into the dark web months later. And so we see where not only bad backlinks, but SEO, where you use SEO and AI to actually outrank even the federal government. And that can have profound risk, as we see here. And so we see lots of these different examples. And so we're going to highlight a few of these now in this next part. So let's take a look at some of these examples. And the way I tried to categorize this to make sense, because this can be sometimes a little bit overwhelming. And so organizing it into kind of buckets and families of risk and attack vectors is what we do at Forewarn. We analyze all of these. And so the categories on the left-hand side, so we're going to talk about black hat and technical SEO, not something that traditionally lands you into prison, but it goes against search guidelines and it has real repercussions for organizations. Synthetic and AI deception, we're going to talk about collusion network when organized groups get together to commit fraud and opportunism. And we're going to highlight a few of these examples now. So we'll dive deep here, and we're going to illustrate a few companies. And these are publicly available. These are known threats that we've seen and shared before. Black hat SEO, there's a notion of what we call keyword stuffing. Keyword stuffing is where you take a word and you repeat it many, many times on a particular web page. In the past, this was something that search engines would certainly recognize and penalize. But with the advent of AI, you can generate a lot more content much more quickly. And what we're seeing is a proliferation of not just websites, but content within those websites. And what we're seeing here is the use of USAA on a website over close to almost 1,000 times. So why would they do that? Well, this is a way to make a web page appear authoritative and actually a great way to drive traffic. And so to pick off traffic, not just from USAA, but anybody having a question around what they might be trying to rank for. And what's remarkable is we're also beginning to see something called web cloaking, where you take the keyword USAA or whatever phrase you'd like, maybe they don't pay claims or somebody doesn't pay claims, and you put the font color the same as the web page color, so it blends right into the screen. So a human eye can't detect it, but a search bot can. And as a result, you begin to raise that rank up for a nefarious site. We see fake law firms who will spawn up new domains with different names. In some cases, when we can identify them, we share this with Google. It can be de-indexed and literally removed from the site and from the search index. But it's a way of protecting organizations and companies. We see semantic SEO. So travelers, as we know, is all spelled with one L. But what happens when an opportunist see it? They see the world from a very different perspective, and they may see travelers with two L's. And so as a result, you begin to see the bidding of travelers with two L's so they can pick off traffic to their site. They can create fake websites with two L's. They can pay claims with, process claims with two L's. So we see these types of techniques. There's nearly a couple dozen different, what we call black hat techniques that exist and certainly need to be stopped. We mentioned about some of the toxic backlinks, but one of the services that we often provide is being able to audit all of your backlinks coming in, because even the smallest of companies that sometimes we engage with, we will start to see activity coming from across the world. And so if you have a company that's based in, say, Wisconsin, doing business in just Wisconsin, why do they have 15 countries who are also attaching to their site, trying to drive different services or trying to potentially commit fraud? And so we see these patterns emerging. We also begin to see the notion of large language model content injection. So like I said, we're all starting to use chat services like ChatGPT. But what happens when we start to use them as search engines? More and more of us are doing this. In fact, Google, just last week, we were on a call with the head of search and the head of AI. And for the first time, 2024 represented the peak in search traffic. What's happened is it's gone down because it's now migrated over to the large language models like ChatGPT or Mode AI. And what we're seeing, though, is that even this can be manipulated. And even here, you can see in this very first statement, you should avoid giving a statement to a State Farm adjuster without first consulting a lawyer. State Farm may fight to delay payment and question the validity of your injuries. This is Google Gemini providing this answer. So the question then becomes, how does this get inside Google Gemini? How does a large language model potentially get manipulated? And that's exactly what's happened here, right? We're seeing law firms, in this case, ranking for content. And as I mentioned, SEO matters to large language models. In fact, the way Google Gemini has worked traditionally is that it picks 75% of its content off the top 12 search positions. So if you can rank up, if you can build content up, you're going to become a viable intake to the algorithm of the large language model. That has continued to expand with some of the kind of next generation approaches for what's feeding into that model. But you can see that you can begin to have a very you can instigate a claim from a contested space just from this type of activity. And when it's targeted to companies, represents a whole new way of risk. We're seeing engines like Copilot affected. Of course, even other engines like Yandex, which is a Russian search engine. Of course, you might expect to see some activity on this. So this is what we're looking out for, and policing this and understanding how this affects your brand and the exploitation of your brand is really the heart of what we're trying to see and do at Forewarn. I mentioned about doppelganger websites. This is a real world example of one of our clients, a large MGA. Their site, again, carbon copied, hosted off of a server in Norway, run by a group out of Russia. And again, they were trying to sell insurance, process claims, as well as a collection of other exploited websites from them. We even see this with reinsurers. They are not immune to this type of targeting. So AI is being used to copy sites. It's also being used to spawn up new content, but also new interfaces for, in this case, insurers to log in and share information. Again, harvesting information, just as we saw with Louisiana citizens and the exploitation of their situation. So these are the real risks that we have to look out for. The last part I'll mention just is around this idea of collusive activity. And one of those is really a focus around manipulation rings, and even in the case of user-generated content. Many of us may not be on TikTok. We may not be all the time on Facebook or so on, but those represent kind of that next generation way of communicating, as well as being able to promote a brand, right? And we've seen it, but we're also seeing it being used to be weaponized. And what we're finding is there are some opportunists who are not only sponsoring their own content and creating content, but they're hiring others to engineer content for them. Even though they may not be a client of theirs, they're promoting information that is then attached and targeted to a particular company. We're also seeing an immense amount of activity around very specific legal-based marketing firms that have the expertise and the science. And I use that term a lot, but the science of marketing has changed so much from in the last just few years that the science has become much more profound and exacting in terms of how we think about content online. And so we can see examples here where it's become a business model. We see brand impersonation happen, where folks are pretending to be part of a company or representing a brand or an extension of that brand. And again, to us, this needs to be identified. To us, this is a trademark infringement. We also see collusive bidding. So I mentioned how you can get traffic to your website through pay-per-click activity. So imagine if you had 2 or 3 bad actors grouped together to bid together and outbid everybody else in the market for certain keywords so that website traffic goes to your sites and your clicks. And we see that happening. In fact, there was one example recently where we were working with a carrier who between a auto body shop, a personal injury lawyer, and a medical office, all bidding on keywords, but they were also driving a scheme across the country, across different cities with that same targeting, and collectively generating claims in the total of about $27 million. So these are real threats. So what do we do about it? And that's where Forewarn was kind of, I always said this was the company that we weren't even focused on wanting to build a company. This was actually a response to what we were seeing because it was so great. And so we focus on what we call digital risk intelligence. And the idea here is to detect and disrupt tech-enabled opportunism. How is this emerging? How is it not only spawning loss and litigation, but potentially fraud? And the goal here is not just to protect the carriers, but the policyholders as well, because they're also being exposed to these same tactics. And we've seen this across so many different businesses, from carriers, transportation to retail, family offices. small businesses, all are affected with these types of schemes. Today, we analyze and scan roughly 750 billion data points across search engines, search platforms, marketing platforms. We triangulate and cross-validate data so that we can understand the breadcrumbs that are being left behind in the activity that we see online across these different marketing campaigns. And we scan roughly 20,000 opportunists across 1,500 companies on a daily basis. We are looking for activity. We're trying to see who works with one another potentially, but also what are the new emerging patterns and schemes that are forming, not just in our state, but nationally, because something that happens in the Pacific Northwest or up in Maine may have a profound impact for somebody in Georgia. So we need to be able to understand those behaviors, and we put all of this information into what we call a threat intelligence report. These are run quarterly. The surveillance and the alerting is happening continuously, and we provide this in the form of various use cases. To give you a sense of breakdown of forewarn, a little more depth, we try to ask the question right up front: what are you up against? Who are you up against? Are you facing a local law firm or a local contractor or adjuster or maybe a cyber group? Or are you backed by some type of national syndicate or state-sponsored cyber organization looking to drive activity? We are surveilling across a collection of different attack vectors, from collusive networks to black hat SEO approaches and brand impersonation to third-party litigation funding rings. Because understanding the size, the scale, and magnitude is really important. And we want to put this information up into understanding the claim patterns that we're seeing and the risks that we're seeing, and then using that information downstream to impact the rest of the organization. We also then want to help prioritize how to respond. For many organizations, we feel already overworked, overloaded. There's just not enough Tylenol in our day to, calm our headaches. But at the end of the day, we also need to have help prioritizing what to go after because there is so much. And part of what we're doing here, a running joke from our clients, is they call this the Death Star. But this is an image, a real live image of thousands of opportunists. And in the middle there, on the upper right hand, is an actual company being targeted by various opportunists. What we're looking at is how they're connected, and we're monitoring the behavior of how these organizations are connected to one another, some in the US, some global, but they're all working together in concert to create a new form of risk. And this is what we call forewarned topolistics. The idea is to track this and help organizations get ahead of it. The last part is then we summarize this up into what we call a risk score. And this is, again, a way to quantify and frankly, to be transparent with the company to say, here's your current risk, here's your risk relative to the folks that are targeting you, the opportunists that are targeting you, how much they're targeting you, but also, is it working against you? Are they successful at what they do? And do you have you have vulnerabilities internally to be able to respond? Is there a point? So we monitor all of this in the form of new forms of strategic intelligence and make that actionable, not just for, say, a claims team, but across an entire organization, because each will have a different perspective. The last thing I'll just mention is we talk a lot about surveillance and topolistics, but putting this into work across different teams, there are different use cases for different groups. So for those representing different departments today, know that this information can be repurposed for all different use cases, as you can see here, from triage through screening to underwriting, even up to marketing. Oftentimes in marketing, we think of it as a brand building exercise. And the running joke I often like to say is, if you want to hide a dead body, you put it on page 2 of Google, because nobody ever goes to Google, right? To second page, right? And that's true with opportunists. When we run our searches for, say, the claims department phone number, if we're sitting in our headquarters or maybe even our home, we may be appearing in the first ranked position or maybe the top 3 or 4 positions. But what happens if we move 4 or 5 zip codes down the street? Do we still get the same results? And if not, how are we looking at defending our marketing efforts? We never think of marketing as a defense measure, but we actually, in this next generation with AI, have to begin thinking about, as do all departments, how do we prioritize and how do we protect ourselves from this type of digital risk? A big part of this is how do we build a better digital moat around the business? And when it works right, it works really well. And so this is an example of a client on the left hand that started with a risk score of 71. They dropped it to 47 in less than 9 months. And in this time, we had detected a false site. We detected a false bill payment site. We detected bad logins that were for agents that were being manipulated. Of course, we had opportunism and areas of fraud being committed, but also being able to shore up a really great response and mitigation strategy. I mentioned Louisiana citizens earlier. Just to give you a sense, and this is Richard Newberry, in just 3 months, they saved over $9 million in their claims, and they count 1% in their litigated claim frequency dropping, which is translated to that $9 million. So that's a really big deal in being able to offer up results. So with that, I'm going to ask certainly, we'll open it up to some questions. And certainly encourage all of you, please, if you have more questions or would like a more personal view of Forewarn, we'd certainly love the opportunity to share more. Certainly follow us up on LinkedIn, and look forward to next answering some questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Todd. Such interesting information. I know I was unaware of many of these things, and I imagine that's probably the case for a lot of consumers. So a couple of questions that were received are pretty similar. So thank you for the work you're doing. What do we do individually as the consumer, as the policyholder, as the person buying the insurance from the insurance company? What can we do to help?
Great. Yeah, great questions. There are so many different personal kind of use cases in our day in terms of protecting our own digital risks, as we've seen. First and foremost, if we do have a legitimate claim, if we do have a real issue, certainly we contact our insurance companies directly. As we've seen, there's a lot of interception around, hey, talk to a law firm first, or talk to us first. In the past, we've seen contractors driving AOBs, right? It's assignment of benefits, and saying, hey, we'll negotiate with the insurance company ourselves. Don't worry about it, homeowner. And so have that direct relationship, because that more times than not, they're there to bat for you. They are there to work for you and work with you. Even on the digital risks, we carry our phones with us all the time. One of the questions I often ask folks is, when was the last time you turned your phone off? Literally shut it down. Because from a digital risk perspective, what most people don't realize in the world of cyber, there are many websites that we go to that drop little bits of code, and these are non-transient. They may just sit there. I give the experience, and this is the personal feeling of, you just had that conversation with your spouse, and then all of a sudden you've just been given an advertisement. You say, is that coincidental, or were they listening in on the phone conversation? Well, there is code to be able to do that. And so what we often say, these are non-transient programs that are being run. And so what we often suggest is just turn your phone off and reboot it, because that will erase or delete those types of codes that are running in the backdrop of your phone. And then certainly reboot. Always update your operating system. Again, we work with a lot of federal agencies. The activities that we're seeing online are really scary. I'll give you another example. Search. When we run a Google search today, it's very common. We get a set of results, which is great. In certain cases, we're seeing certain companies being targeted, and large retail companies sometimes are on the ends of those targeting. And so just be very careful before clicking on something, because what we often will see is those search results that you're expecting, maybe they are replaced. They feel the same, look the same, but they're being served off of servers from an adversarial country. And we've seen various examples of that starting to form more and more now nationally. And so in working with groups like the NSA and others to help us identify, but also to bring awareness to folks around these issues, we always say, just do an extra read, look at that URL. I shared some examples earlier of websites that would be common to, say, file a flood claim with FEMA, or programs that we'd expect to be kind of sanitized and protected. But just do a double check each time you're looking at those URLs if you can.
Yep. Great advice. And I'll just add to that, talk to your broker, your insurance agent, whoever it is, also if you're not sure. So go straight to the insurance carrier, but use us too, because we definitely have the correct information on how to get a hold of them. So that's great. Thanks. So on that AI generated portion, when you talked about how the fraudulent information is being put in that overview, can you talk just a little bit? I'm sure there's a lot behind it, but can you give us a little bit more on how does that work? How does we rely on that information as truth, like you said?
Yeah.
How does it make it into that
Yeah.
overview?
So, one of the reasons I wanted to talk about SEO first before we talk about AI. So, in the world of marketing, the world of content, we create these content articles with keywords that get indexed and parsed for ranking. And that was in the past, that's how search engines would kind of algorithmically look at how to rank something along with a couple of other metrics, a couple of key metrics. But what's evolved or what's changed with AI and large language models is now they are looking at content in a very different way. It's not so much about the density of that content. They're looking at the if you will, the engagement of a user with that content. And there's something called, believe it or not, it's a quantification of the readability of a site called a flesh score. And so it looks at the sentence length, it looks at the number of syllables in a word, but is this a fifth grade reading level? Is this sixth grade, seventh grade, eighth grade? By quantifying that, we begin to large language models have a better or easier way of reading that material. And what opportunists had figured out, and recently in the last 6 months, is if they could build content that's really simple and easy to understand, they would actually outrank even large companies for the same content, except that they were able to inject it right into large language models and manipulate what they might want to say. And so this is why we call alarm bells off on this, because this is a concern, right? The algorithms of this are still being defined out. This is still very early on. We think about the internet, now we've been using this for decades, but it's taken some time to kind of iron out a lot of problems that we've had. And you think of across all different business units, AI is in its infancy, and there's a lot that's going to come through with what we're going to see. So, I think for businesses, this looks at a whole different perspective of how we market, what content we use, and how we interact. For people using these services and on websites and engaging, this really requires a little bit extra, read through as much as we can.
Sure. And I think we are used to information at our fingertips, and so we will take maybe that path of least resistance of you give me the short and dirty up here at the top. I'm going to take it. So
Right. Yes.
good to know. Well, I'll take one last question here. You talked mostly about property casualty. Do you see this impacting other lines going into healthcare, other types of insurance outside of P&C?
Yes, actually, I was just on a subcommittee panel on long-term care, and we're seeing this in life insurance products. We're seeing synthetic IDs. We're seeing websites and cyber groups stealing those IDs. And so, yes, we see it in life insurance. We see it in workers' comp. We certainly see it across all lines. I'd like to tell you that it was just contained to P&C, and that it was just in Florida, but it's not, right? Florida was just the kind of initial grounds, but this has become not just a national, but a global issue because we see some of the same tactics being done overseas as well. And it's not just insurance, right? As we've seen, it's in transportation. Some of them are captives, so yes, they're very much targeted. Risk retention groups are being targeted. So there's a lot of activity here. And whether it's because we're a part of this litigious society or not, we are still finding activity globally using these tactics and techniques.
Yeah. Okay. Well, appreciate your time and all the information you provided. If those participating here, if your question, you didn't make it into the chat or you had something else that pops up, feel free to contact. You've got the contact information there for Forewarn, or contact your USI representative and we'll be happy to assist you. So with that, thank you again, Todd, for your time, and we appreciate you fighting the fight.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join.
All right. Thank you.